Her name was Captain Aisha Rahman, though in the barracks and on the flight line most knew her simply as Falcon. She wore the call sign lightly, never chasing the bravado that came with it. On quiet mornings, she was just another pilot, standing on the tarmac with the dawn spreading across the horizon, watching the F-16s gleam under the first touch of sunlight. To those who knew her outside the uniform, she was the daughter who called her mother every Sunday, the sister who never forgot birthdays, the woman who still kept a dog-eared notebook of poems in her flight bag. Her beginnings had never been easy. Growing up, she had lived under skies torn with sound, jets flying overhead, drills echoing from distant bases. The airfields near her hometown had been her first classroom. While other children traced clouds with their eyes, Aisha tried to match the angle of the contrails, whispering the names of aircraft she had memorized from borrowed manuals. It wasn't ambition that stirred in her back then. It was something quieter, an ache, as if the skies themselves had been calling her name. When she first stepped into training, her uniform felt too stiff, her boots too heavy. The men around her carried themselves with the kind of certainty she could only pretend to own. She did not let them see her hands tremble during pre-flight checks, nor how her heart hammered every time the engines screamed awake. Yet even in those early days, there was a steadiness to her, an instinct not easily measured in classroom scores or simulator drills. She listened more than she spoke. She absorbed the rhythms of flight, the language of the aircraft, the subtle tremors in the stick that spoke of turbulence before it arrived. The instructors noticed, though they seldom said much. What they saw was not raw aggression but restraint, as if she understood that mastery came not from overpowering the machine but from yielding to it, moving with it. The jet was not a weapon to her. It was an extension of breath, of thought, of resolve. Her fellow pilots often underestimated her. Some were polite about it, disguising doubt behind smiles. Others were less gentle, questioning her place, whispering that she would fold under pressure when the sky turned hostile. Aisha never answered them. She simply studied longer, flew with quiet precision, and returned to her dormitory with the smell of jet fuel clinging to her hair like a stubborn perfume. There were nights she lay awake staring at the ceiling, exhaustion pressing against her chest, and wondered if they were right. She thought of her father's silence at the dinner table the night she told him she would apply for the Air Force. He had not forbidden her, but his eyes had carried a weight she could not shake. It was as if he feared the sky would take her from him, the way it had taken others before. Still, she rose each morning before dawn, walked to the hangar, and placed her hand against the cool metal of the F-16. One more day, she would whisper under her breath, almost like a prayer. Each flight became a dialogue between fear and courage, between fragility and strength. The first time she broke through the clouds at supersonic speed, the world fell away in silence. Below her stretched the landscape in muted colors, rivers like veins across the earth, cities no bigger than scattered toys. She felt impossibly small and impossibly vast all at once. The hum of the engine was steady in her bones, but in her heart there was only stillness. It was in that stillness she realized she belonged here. Not because she wanted to prove anyone wrong, not even because she craved glory, but because flight itself had always been her language of freedom. Her commanders tested her endlessly. Simulations stacked against her, scenarios designed to push her beyond exhaustion. She learned to read radar like a second heartbeat, to distinguish enemy signatures from friendly ones in fractions of a second. She studied tactics late into the night, mapping formations until the lines blurred into dreams. She carried herself carefully, never boasting, never snapping back at the remarks that trailed her in the mess hall. Instead, she wrote lines of poetry in her notebook about skies and silence, about strength that did not shout but endured. In time, her fellow pilots began to see it, the quiet discipline, the patience that endured long after adrenaline had faded. She never announced herself, but the sky had a way of revealing truth. Her dogfights in training became the stuff of whispered respect, not because she was reckless, but because she was unshakably precise. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the hangar doors glowed orange, she lingered near her aircraft. Her gloves were tucked into her belt, her face still streaked with sweat from maneuvers. She pressed her hand once more against the fuselage, and for the first time, she allowed herself a smile. It was not a smile of triumph, but of belonging. In that moment, she understood. The skies had always been waiting for her, and though the world might doubt, she carried within her something far greater than talent. It was resilience, the kind that could withstand storms, doubts, and the sharp edge of war itself. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew the day would come when the world would see it too. The first time Captain Aisha Rahman faced the sky in war, the horizon was not calm, but jagged with fire. The desert stretched beneath her, endless and silent. Yet above, the air was crowded with the roar of jets and the distant, thunderous blossoms of anti-aircraft fire. It was not like the simulations or the training exercises. There was no instructor's voice guiding her through radio static, no reset button if she faltered. This was real, and the weight of that truth pressed against her chest like an invisible hand. Her canopy reflected the orange glow of explosions in the distance. The air smelled faintly of ozone and burning fuel, even from her sealed cockpit, as if war itself seeped through every barrier. Sweat gathered under her helmet, dampening the fabric around her temples. She kept her breathing steady, one measured inhale at a time, anchoring herself in the rhythm. The orders had been clear: intercept and hold. But clarity of command never softened the chaos of execution. Radar screens blinked with signatures, some friend, some foe, many blurred in the fog of combat. Her squadron moved like shadows across the sky, voices clipped and terse over comms. Beneath the coded chatter, Aisha felt the pulse of unspoken fear, as though each pilot carried the same question in silence. Will I make it back? For Aisha, doubt ran deeper. She remembered the words she had overheard only days earlier in the hangar. She flies clean, but she's never been tested. Let's see what happens when the real fire comes. They had known she was close enough to hear, and she had pretended she didn't. But the words lingered now, sharp as glass, threatening to fracture her focus. She pushed the thought away, clenching the stick tighter as her jet rolled into formation. Below, the desert was marked by sudden flares of artillery. In her ears, the world shrank to engine roar, radar pings, and the occasional bark of her commander's voice. Then came the call. Enemy contacts. Fast, multiple, closing from the east. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs, the way it always did when anticipation sharpened into reality. 20 signatures lit up the radar, crowding the screen like an oncoming storm. Her squadron was outnumbered, and every pilot knew it. The first clash was a blur. Missiles streaked like falling stars, contrails weaving white scars across the heavens. Her jet shuddered as she broke hard to avoid a lock, gravity slamming her against the seat until her vision pulsed gray at the edges. She heard the alarm scream, felt her breath catch in her throat, but her hands moved without hesitation, countermeasures deployed, angles shifted, speed surged. 1 enemy aircraft streaked past, too close. She caught only a flash of metal, the glint of a canopy, then it was gone, leaving the echo of its engines like a taunt. Her instincts screamed at her to chase, but discipline held her steady. She banked left, found her wingman's voice crackling through the static, and locked instead onto a target pressing toward him. Her missile found its mark, a bloom of fire lighting the sky. The victory was clean, but she felt no triumph. Every second stretched long, each decision carrying the weight of life or death. She could not think of herself, or of the doubts that gnawed her. She could only think of the mission, of the voices tethered to her through fragile radio signals, of the countless lives below who depended on the thin line of jets above to hold the storm at bay. And yet, inside her chest, something shifted. Fear had been her first companion that night, but as the battle pressed on, it gave way to a strange calm. The air was chaos, but in the narrow space of her cockpit, she found clarity. She could hear her own voice steady when she called out positions, feel her movements align with the rhythm of her machine. Every evasion, every strike, Every roll of her jet became less an act of survival and more an act of belonging. The sky, brutal as it was, seemed to open for her. But war was never without its cruelty. She heard the broken cry of a fellow pilot's call before silence claimed it, a sound that would follow her long after the mission ended. For a brief, searing moment, she faltered. Her chest tightened, her breath caught, her hands trembled against the stick. He was just there, she thought, the emptiness of his absence almost unbearable. She steadied herself with effort, whispering under her breath words no one else could hear. Not now.
Not yet.
The sky demanded everything, and grief would have to wait. Hours later, when the last enemy jet fled into the distance and the silence of retreat settled heavy over the desert, she realized her own hands were shaking so badly she could barely unfasten her straps. Her gloves were damp with sweat, her throat raw from the dryness of her mask. Back on the ground, the others celebrated survival with weary laughter, slaps on the shoulder, hollow jokes to mask the ache of loss. Aisha stood apart for a while, the night wind cooling the heat still clinging to her. She looked up, and the stars were startlingly bright, indifferent to the fire and fury that had unfolded beneath them. Her commanders would later commend her precision, her calm under fire. Some of her squadron mates began to look at her differently, doubt replaced by something quieter, respect. But for Aisha, the night was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about learning the true cost of the sky she loved, about understanding that every victory carried shadows. She pressed her hand against her jet once more before leaving the hangar, the cool metal grounding her. Her body ached, her heart was heavy, but her resolve was steady. The sky had tested her, and though she carried scars unseen, she had not broken. The mission orders came on a morning so deceptively calm that the base seemed almost at peace. The sky above was a flawless canvas of pale blue, the kind that could have belonged to any ordinary day. Yet beneath that stillness lay a tension that pressed into every breath, every glance exchanged between the pilots. Captain Aisha Rahman felt it in the silence of the briefing room, where maps flickered under the harsh light and commanders spoke in clipped voices, urgency sharpening their tone. The intelligence was stark. A large enemy squadron had crossed into contested airspace. 20 aircraft, heavily armed, flying in tight formation. Their purpose was unmistakable: domination, disruption, destruction. To meet them, only half as many of her own squadron would take flight. Numbers alone made the math brutal. The margin for error was nearly non-existent. When the briefing ended, Aisha sat for a moment longer, hands folded in her lap, staring at the inked lines of the map as if they might rearrange themselves into something less grim. Around her, boots scraped against the floor, voices rose in nervous banter. She heard the steady hum of generators outside, the faint hiss of wind against the hangar doors. The ordinary sounds of a base about to bleed into extraordinary risk. She rose quietly, made her way to the flight line, and laid her hand against the fuselage of her jet. The metal was cool in the morning air. She closed her eyes briefly. One more day, she whispered, as she always did. But this time the words felt heavier, like a vow rather than a routine. Takeoff was a rush of sound and force, engines shattering the stillness, desert sands scattering beneath their wings. The sky welcomed them with a false serenity, the horizon stretching wide and indifferent. Her squadron climbed into formation, each jet a dark arrow against the light. Over the radio, voices were firm, rehearsed, yet beneath them lived an unspoken truth. They all understood how uneven this fight would be. The enemy appeared first as shadows on the radar, then as specks on the horizon, swelling quickly into shapes that filled the sky. 20 jets, their engines growling like a storm rolling across the heavens. For a heartbeat, the silence before impact seemed endless, suspended in fragile tension. Then the sky fractured. Missiles streaked in arcs of fire, contrails curling like white scars. The air erupted with alarms, commands, and the roar of engines straining against gravity. Aisha felt the world tilt into chaos. She banked hard, her body pressed deep into the seat, the blood pulling at her vision. Her fingers moved with instinct, her breath steady despite the storm outside. Around her, her squadron fought fiercely, but the numbers pressed cruelly against them. She heard the clipped shouts over comms, the breathless reports of missiles fired, of locks gained and lost. Every second demanded choice: who to protect, which threat to chase, when to strike, when to evade. It was then, in the eye of the storm, that something inside her sharpened. Fear fell away, leaving behind only a clear, precise awareness. The battlefield unfolded not as chaos, but as a pattern, a rhythm. She could see the arcs of enemy movement before they happened, hear the intent in the static of their maneuvers. The sky became not confusion but choreography, and she was no longer following it. She was leading it. Her jet moved with her as if it, too, had been waiting for this moment. She rolled through the smoke of a near miss, inverted sharply, and locked onto an enemy tailing her wingman. One missile, then another, both hitting true. She did not linger to watch the flames. Her eyes had already shifted to the next threat. The radio crackled with disbelief. "Falcon, how are you?" But the voice cut off in static as another clash swallowed the sky. Aisha no longer thought of proving herself, nor of the whispers she had endured. All that remained was the clarity of purpose: to hold the line, to shield those who fought beside her, to survive this storm long enough to turn its tide. She threaded through enemy fire with impossible precision, striking fast, retreating faster, always 2 moves ahead. Her presence became an anchor in the chaos, her calls calm, her actions decisive. One by one, enemy jets fell. The sky, moments ago suffocating with their numbers, began to thin. Her squadron rallied around her, instinctively aligning to her maneuvers, trusting the rhythm she had carved into the battle. But victory was never clean. Twice she felt the shudder of near death, once when a missile brushed past, so close it rattled her bones, once when an enemy jet dove head-on, and she broke away with a margin so narrow her breath caught in her throat. The sky was merciless, and survival was not a guarantee, but a fragile grace. At last, after what felt like an eternity compressed into minutes, the remaining enemy jets broke formation. They scattered, fleeing back toward the horizon from which they had come. The air stilled, save for the lingering hiss of calms and the ragged breaths of her squadron. Only then did Aisha allow herself to exhale fully. Her gloves were slick with sweat, her shoulders aching from the strain of every maneuver. Yet inside, she felt no collapse, no trembling. Only stillness, the kind that came when fear had been faced and overcome. Back at base, the others looked at her differently. Their words were few, their expressions heavy with exhaustion, but their eyes carried something new, undeniable respect. The whispers of doubt had been burned away by fire and sky. Later that night, she sat alone near the edge of the runway. The desert wind curled around her, carrying the faint scent of dust and fuel. She looked up at the stars, as bright and indifferent as ever, and let the memory wash over her. Not triumph, not glory, only the knowledge that she had walked through the storm and returned. She traced the edge of her flight gloves with tired fingers, her heart steady. The turning point had come quietly, not with fanfare, but with the simple truth revealed in the sky. She was not just surviving it anymore. She belonged to it. The base was quieter in the weeks that followed the great battle. Engines still roared at dawn, boots still struck against gravel, but the air carried a different weight now, a silence stitched with both relief and remembrance. For Captain Aisha Rahman, each morning arrived with the same ritual: the slow walk to the hangar, the brief pause to press her hand against the cool skin of her jet, and the whisper of words meant only for herself. Yet something within her had shifted. The sky no longer loomed as a question. It had become her truth. She carried herself with the same humility, never seeking attention, yet others seemed to move differently around her. Younger pilots leaned closer when she spoke, scribbling notes with a kind of reverence. Her peers, once skeptical, now carried respect in their nods, unspoken but unmistakable. Even the commanders, who had always maintained distance, addressed her with a softened gravity, as if recognizing not just a capable pilot but a leader whose strength had been forged under fire. And still, when night fell, she often sat alone at the far edge of the runway, letting the desert wind lift the weight from her shoulders. The stars above glimmered with their usual indifference, but to her they had become companions, silent witnesses to all she had endured. She thought often of the voices lost in static, of the laughter that no longer echoed in the mess hall. Their absence was a hollow she carried, and though she bore it with quiet grace, it never left her. One evening, her wingman approached, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He sat beside her without a word at first, letting the silence stretch. Only after a long moment did he speak. "You kept us alive that day." She didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the distant lights of the airfield. "We kept each other alive," she answered softly. But he shook his head, the steam from his cup curling between them.
"No."
"You saw the battle differently. The rest of us, we were just surviving. You were guiding us. Like you knew where the sky wanted us to be." His words lingered with her long after he left. She had never thought of it that way, not as leadership, not as vision. She had only done what felt necessary, moving where instinct and clarity had carried her. But perhaps that was what strength looked like, not the loud defiance she had always imagined, but a quiet rhythm that others could follow. In the days that followed, she began to embrace that role, though never with arrogance. She trained longer, not for herself alone, but to share what she had learned. She walked the younger pilots through maneuvers, explained the subtle shifts in radar patterns, the way to listen to silence as much as to alarms. She taught them not just tactics, but patience, the art of steady breathing, the resilience of mind when the sky turned hostile. They listened, not because she demanded it, but because they saw in her what they longed to find in themselves: calm within chaos, purpose within fear. Yet Aisha never let herself forget the cost. She kept a small notebook tucked in her locker, its pages filled not with poems now, but with names, those she had flown with, those who had not returned. Each name was a promise, a reminder that survival was not enough unless it carried meaning. On her rare days of leave, she returned home, to the narrow streets and quiet courtyards of her childhood. Her mother would hold her for long moments without speaking, her father's silence now softened into pride he rarely voiced. Children from the neighborhood sometimes gathered at the gate, wide-eyed at the sight of her uniform, asking breathless questions about the sky. She would kneel to meet their gaze, answering gently, never with embellishment, but always with wonder. She told them the sky was vast, yes, but it belonged to those willing to rise into it with courage. Alone in her room, she often sat by the window, staring at the same expanse she had once traced as a child. The years between felt both endless and fleeting. She thought of who she had been, the girl whispering aircraft names under her breath, the cadet trembling in her first flight, the pilot who whispered "one more day" against the skin of her jet. Each version of herself still lived within her, woven into the woman she had become. As the war dragged on, missions continued, each one carrying risk, each one carving new lines into the fabric of her memory. But now she carried into every sortie not only her own resolve, but the weight of those who followed her lead, who trusted her clarity. It was a burden, yes, but also a gift, a reminder that strength was never hers alone. One night, long after another mission had ended, she stood again by the runway, the desert wind tugging at her flight suit. She closed her eyes, breathing in the silence, letting the fatigue of the day slip from her shoulders. She thought of the future, not in grand, certain strokes, but in quiet possibilities. Perhaps one day she would leave the cockpit behind, perhaps she would teach, perhaps she would write again. But no matter where life carried her, she knew the sky would remain within her, a language she would always speak, a rhythm she would always hear. When she opened her eyes, the horizon was just beginning to pale with the first hint of dawn. She smiled, not the smile of triumph, but of peace. Today, she stood not only as a veteran, not only as a survivor, but as something deeper, a beacon of quiet resilience. And though the world might never know her name beyond the call sign Falcon, those who had flown with her would carry her strength in their own skies. The sun broke over the desert, washing the airfield in light. A new day had come, and she was ready to meet it. The war did not end with a single battle. It lingered, like smoke that refused to clear, curling through the days and settling into the bones of those who carried its burden. For Captain Aisha Rahman, each mission blurred into the next, a rhythm of briefings, flight checks, the piercing roar of engines, and the endless expanse of sky where the difference between survival and loss was measured in heartbeats. Yet beneath that rhythm, something quieter had begun to stir within her. She felt it most when she walked alone through the hangar after others had left, the air heavy with the scent of oil and steel. Her footsteps echoed against the metal, and she found herself listening to those echoes as if they belonged to someone else. The question returned again and again, unspoken but insistent. How long could she carry this? One evening, after a mission that had stretched into the night, she lingered outside instead of returning to quarters. The desert air was cool, and the stars seemed close enough to touch. She sat on the cold wing of her jet, the machine humming faintly as it cooled. Her body ached, not from injury but from the weight of years, of every takeoff that carried no guarantee of return. A voice broke her solitude. "You never rest, do you?" She turned to see her commander, a man who rarely ventured beyond duty's formalities. He stood with his cap tucked under his arm, his face softened by the pale light. "I rest," she said quietly, "just not always when I should." He studied her for a moment, then sat beside her on the wing, the unlikely gesture carrying more comfort than words. For a while they said nothing, listening to the faint whine of distant generators, the whisper of sand shifting across the runway. Finally he spoke again. "War has a way of stealing more than it gives. But every so often, someone leaves behind more than they lose." His gaze met hers, steady. "You've become that kind of someone." She looked away, the words pressing into the spaces she rarely let others touch. "I only do what I must. And yet others are learning from you. That matters." His presence was brief, but the weight of his words remained long after he left. That night, she could not sleep. She turned the thought over in her mind, the idea of leaving behind something greater than herself. It was not medals or recognition she wanted, but perhaps there was meaning in passing forward what she had carried, in shaping the hands that would one day take her place. The next morning, she gathered the younger pilots not in the briefing room, but outside on the tarmac, under the vast sky. She spoke simply, without ceremony, about the things that could not be written into manuals, the way silence on the comms sometimes told more than static, how the smallest hesitation could save or cost lives, how courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act through it. Her words were met with quiet, intent faces. They did not applaud or cheer, but she saw it in their eyes, the way they listened, the way they carried her voice into their own silence. For the first time, she felt not only like a pilot, but like a teacher. In private moments, she wrote again. The notebook she had once filled with names and promises grew heavier with pages. Now it held not only loss but guidance, notes, sketches of maneuvers, reflections on the balance between instinct and discipline. She did not know who would read them, or if anyone ever would, but the act itself felt like laying stones along a path for others to follow. Still, there were nights when her strength faltered. Dreams returned, filled with the thunder of engines and the sudden flare of fire. She would wake in darkness, breath sharp, hand trembling against the sheets. Those moments she kept hidden, her scars invisible but real. And yet, even in those shadows, she refused to surrender. She rose, washed her face, and walked once more to the airfield, letting the dawn steady her heart. As weeks turned into months, whispers of peace began to thread their way through the camp. Rumors of negotiations, of treaties being shaped far beyond their reach. No one dared to hope too loudly, for hope had been broken before. But Aisha felt the change, faint as the shifting of the wind before a storm. One morning, after a sortie that ended without engagement, She lingered in the cockpit, her helmet resting in her lap. The sky stretched endless above, quiet, almost gentle. She thought of what peace might mean. Not absence of duty, but perhaps the chance to live without measuring each day against the possibility of loss. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a tomorrow. A tomorrow where the roar of engines did not dictate the rhythm of her life, where she could sit with her parents without the shadow of departure, where she might even teach young cadets, not with urgency, but with patience. The thought did not erase the war's weight, but it softened it, like dawn softens the edge of night. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert gold, she walked the runway slowly, each step deliberate. She whispered the words she had carried for so long. One more day. But this time, the words felt different. They were not a plea for survival alone, but a promise to herself that if peace did come, she would step into it with the same courage she had carried through the fire. She lifted her gaze to the horizon, where the sky and earth met in quiet embrace. Tomorrow was not yet certain, but for the first time it felt possible. And that was enough. The news came not with fanfare, but in the hushed tones of a briefing room heavy with anticipation. The war, they said, had ended. The words hung in the air, fragile and unreal, as though speaking them too loudly might shatter their truth. Papers shuffled, radios clicked, and somewhere beyond the compound walls, the wind carried on as if nothing had changed. For Captain Aisha Rahman, the announcement did not land as relief at first. Instead, it felt like a hollow pause, a silence after years of relentless thunder. She sat among her fellow pilots, her hands folded tightly in her lap, listening to the murmurs ripple around her. Some whispered of homecomings, of long-awaited embraces. Others remained wary, fearing that peace might prove no sturdier than smoke. When the meeting ended, she walked outside into the cool dusk. The sky was streaked with violet and gold, fading into the first stars. For so long, she had looked at that horizon with the weight of duty pressing down her spine. Tonight, it stretched open, wide and unclaimed, and she did not know what to do with it. She wandered toward the hangar, where her F-16 rested in shadow. Her fingertips traced its steel skin, the metal cool beneath her touch. This machine had been her shield, her voice, her battlefield companion. She remembered every vibration of its engine, every trembling moment of descent, every time she had whispered a quiet prayer before releasing the brakes. Now the jet stood still, silent. For the first time in years, it might never be asked to rise in war again. The thought was at once comforting and unbearable. That night she lay awake, the barracks unusually quiet. Sleep refused her, replaced by memories unspooling, faces of comrades lost, the sting of sand carried in the cockpit, the thunderous roar of 20 enemy jets that once filled her with fear and defiance. She closed her eyes and felt tears gather, not of grief alone but of release. The war was over, yet it lived within her still. The following weeks blurred with ceremonies, handshakes, and paperwork. Each day carried reminders that she was not just a soldier anymore, but something more fragile, more ordinary, a veteran preparing to step into civilian life. The word itself felt strange on her tongue, heavy with both pride and uncertainty. One morning, as she packed the last of her belongings into a plain duffel bag, she paused over the small notebook that had traveled with her through every deployment. Its pages were worn, edges curled, ink smudged by sweat and weather. She opened it gently, her eyes scanning words that bore witness to her journey, scribbled notes on tactics, names of the fallen, fragments of reflection she had never shared aloud. She closed the notebook and slipped it carefully into the bag. It was not just hers anymore. Someday, she thought, it might guide another set of hands. When she returned home, the air felt different, thicker somehow, rich with the scent of rain-soaked earth and cooking fires. Her parents stood waiting at the gate, their faces older, yet achingly familiar. The embrace was wordless, tears threading down her mother's cheeks as her father's arms wrapped tightly around her. For a moment, She let herself sink into that warmth, as though she were a child again. But the world she came back to was not the same as the one she had left. Streets seemed narrower, crowds louder, the rhythm of civilian life bewildering in its simplicity. She smiled when neighbors greeted her, but at night, the silence pressed too heavily. She missed the constant hum of engines, the structured clarity of missions. In its absence, every tick of the clock felt unmoored. One evening, she walked to a nearby field where children flew kites against the fading sun. The laughter rose sharp and clear, tugging at something inside her. She sat on a stone wall, watching the paper shapes dart and dance in the wind. The sky, once a place of fire and survival, now carried only color and play. She exhaled slowly, a quiet ache in her chest. It was then she understood. Peace was not the end of war, but its echo, a space in which she would learn to carry both the weight and the light. She could not erase the years behind her, but she could shape what lay ahead. In time, she began to visit the academy again, not as a pilot, but as a mentor. Young cadets gathered in classrooms, their faces eager, their notebooks open wide. She spoke of discipline, of skill, but also of humanity, the quiet strength found in fear, the courage of carrying on for those beside you. Sometimes her voice trembled, but she let it. Truth, she knew, carried its own power. Her hands, once accustomed to throttles and triggers, now traced diagrams on whiteboards and steadied nervous recruits. In their eyes, she saw a reflection of herself long ago, and with it, the chance to give back what the war had taken from so many. On quiet nights, when the wind carried softly through the trees, she still dreamed of the roar of engines. But now, when she woke, she would open her window, breathe in the calm air, and let the sound dissolve into the night. Captain Aisha Rahman remained a soldier at heart, but she was no longer only that. She was a teacher, a daughter, a survivor who had walked through fire and carried something back, not just scars, but strength, hope, and the promise of tomorrow. And as she stood at the academy gates one evening, the sky above painted with the soft glow of twilight, she lifted her gaze upward once more. This time, she did not see a battlefield. She saw possibility. The sky had grown quiet, and at last so had her heart.